OCO, and welcome to the Cherokee Phoenix Breakdown. I am Tyler Thomas, the executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and I am honored to be joined by Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr., as well as Rock the Vote Director Reverend David Wilson. In this episode, Chief Hoskin and Reverend Wilson and I will discuss the upcoming state and federal elections in Oklahoma and why it is important to know where candidates stand on Native issues, especially when it comes to the tribe's sovereignty. We will also discuss recent legislation passed by Cherokee Nation Tribal Council and signed by Chief Hoskin that reforms the tribe's election law, including provisions aimed at preventing dark money from coming into tribal elections. Chief Hoskin, Reverend Wilson, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
All right, so we're in the home stretch of primary season here in Oklahoma. The ballot in 2022 is loaded with races that could have a major impact on tribal nations and the relationships between those nations and the state of Oklahoma, as well as the United States of America. Reverend Wilson, Rock the Native Vote has been very active this election season. What kind of success has the group had leading up to the June 3rd voter registration deadline that passed last week?
Thank you, Tyler, for that intro and for that information. We have been super busy. I think we have been, our voter registration we set up at various events. We have probably been to 60 at least events in the greater Tulsa and greater Oklahoma City area and even outside of the area. Just last Thursday, Cherokee Nation was part of our event to remember the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which was in essence an act of Congress to give citizenship to our ancestors. I tell folk often my grandfather was on my Choctaw side was a World War I code talker, and I always thought about him serving in the war long before he was a U.S. citizen. And I think my history tells me that that was an impetus for that particular legislation. So we gathered and we met in about 8 different towns and cities across the state, and to just mobilize folks to come and register to vote. I got to stop in at Cherokee Nation, had a great turnout, Ponca City, Okmulgee, Oklahoma City, so many other places. And so we felt good about this last minute push the day before the deadline for the primary for that. And of course, we have a strong social media presence on all sorts of channels there in Oklahoma City and Tulsa area. And we also partner with Vote Your Values. And so we use a lot of their stuff. They have great stuff on their social media. And we shared that as well about deadlines, reminding folks to vote, so forth and so forth. And so we appreciate that work. And of course, getting to partner with Cherokee Vote and another organization such as ARP Oklahoma. And so those are primarily in the state of Oklahoma, the top groups are really focusing on voter registration.
Good deal. Getting the people registered seems like it may be the easy part because people want that free stress bar, t-shirt, or whatever it may be. How do you follow up on getting them registered, but getting them to actually be an active participant in the elections?
Well, 2 things. One is our social media presence. Again, sending out reminders that, hey, this is the deadline to vote. Here's your time period to do absentee ballots, so forth. And we do what we do is when we do our voter registration, we collect the names and addresses. So we send card reminders folk about elections coming up, or this is coming up. But our bigger push is probably on social media that we use, and again using some of the work that Vote Your Values does as well, to make that happen. But that is the hardest part. It's easy. It's tough enough to get folks to register, but it's even tougher to get folks to the polls.
Yeah. Chief Hoskin, much like Rock the Native Vote, the tribe has been diligent in registering its citizens to vote in not only Oklahoma, but throughout the country. What has Cherokee Vote been doing lately to make sure Cherokee Nation citizens have the ability to make their voice heard on June 28th, as well as in November?
Well, thank you, Tyler. It's good to be on with Reverend Wilson. I appreciate his efforts on this great cause. Cherokee Vote is the entity within the Cherokee Nation, the program within the Cherokee Nation to register Cherokees to vote really in all elections. We began it in 2013, and since then, we have brought in thousands and thousands of new Cherokee voters. So lately, we've been stepping up our efforts. So out in the communities, registering voters at various community events. There's been probably a dozen Cherokee Nation community events just in the last month as we've started to get more open across the reservation in terms of public meetings. And so I feel good about those numbers. Working with Rock the Native Vote has also been very beneficial, kind of leveraging both those organizations' shared interest in registering people to vote to do just that. And then even across the country, we've been doing it. So we've taken our Cherokee Vote booth out to California to our at-large meetings. I just got back from the Atlanta, Georgia area. We were registered, dozens of voters. So those kind of efforts are important. But your question's a very good one, which is how do we sustain it, and how do we turn registered voters into voters? And that, I think, takes further engagement by Cherokee Nation, by entities like Rock the Native Vote, and by the candidates themselves.
Chief, Reverend Wilson alluded to this a while ago, but Cherokee Vote, just like Rock the Native Vote, y'all are both part of a larger coalition called Vote Your Values. Why is it important to work with like-minded organizations to help increase the impact of the Native vote?
Well, for one thing, we need to stretch our resources as far as we can. We also have sort of different approaches sometimes. I mean, Cherokee Nation's had an ongoing effort to register voters at community meetings, somewhat passive events where people come by and you register. But an organization like Rock the Native Vote particularly gears up during the election cycle and does a big push, gets a lot of attention. So I think latching on to some of the excitement surrounding their efforts. And then the Vote Your Values coalition is just that. It's about identifying those shared values that the great many people across this region in particular have, Native and non-Native actually, and engaging them and not just registering, but thinking about some of the issues and not just the very important issues dealing with tribal sovereignty, but a range of issues that impact us, from housing to healthcare to education. And I'm talking that impacts everyone. And so you get something that's a bit more issue oriented, and you couple that with an effort to register voters. And I think you start to get that engagement that we really need as the second part of this effort to strengthen the voice of Indian country.
Reverend Wilson, you alluded to this a while ago, but most Native people were not even allowed to vote until 1924. So we are still less than 100 years since Native people were given the right to cast their ballots. However, we are starting to see the younger generations become more engaged in the process and realizing their vote and voice can make a difference. They are seeing Natives elected to state and federal offices and even appointed to positions that are extremely impactful in Indian country. So my question to you is this: why is it important that we continue to grow that engagement, and how impactful can the Native voting bloc be, particularly in a state like Oklahoma?
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you, Tyler. I love that question, especially talking about the younger generation. We, as we set up for voter registration, one of the, probably the largest group that we see less is our young folk who are registering there. And so, we asked this question for ourselves with this younger generation: what makes them get to the polls, and what can we do? And so we hosted a focus group at First Americans Museum earlier this year, gathered about 14 young folks, 18 to 24, all sorts of ethnicities. It's a great group of folk. And so we asked those questions about how do we help you to engage and to get out and vote, on what issues are important to you, and all these kinds of things. And while there are issues that affect older folk, but younger folk are more interested in issues around social justice, about empowerment, about treating each other right. We think about, we talked about the LGBTQ community and the support there, and just a reminder of who we are as people of God, all created the same. And so we are really trying to hone in on that. And what we mean by that is, how do we do our messaging on social media? What images, what pieces do we need to include to attract that age group? And so we're still working on that. And we're so thankful to get to work with young folks on that. And so when I'm with older folk, tribal citizens, they are concerned. Many are not as concerned with the general elections, but they vote in the tribal elections. And so they don't understand, folk don't understand that almost everything we do in our daily lives is dictated by people who make decisions for us. And often those are people who are not like us, and perhaps who do not have our best interest in there. And so we think about, when we think about issues such as roads, taxation, police, land, and more. So it's a continual education that we have to do for our people, and remind folks that someone's out there making these decisions for us, for you, that affect your daily life, and we have to have input. And so today, of course, across the state, that includes office elections for mayor, county commissioners, school boards, legislators, governor, of course, our federal positions, and Congress. And so it's a continued education piece. Every time we set up, we often are there helping to educate people about why this is important. It's done one by one, and sometimes that takes a while, but it certainly is necessary. And if the tribes, Tyler, Chief Hoskin knows this, if we could ever really engage in voting and be in solidarity, man, we get so much done for the tribal peoples in the state.
Absolutely. All right, let's transition our focus of this discussion to the importance of knowing the issues facing Indian country this election cycle and how candidates could impact those issues. Chief Hoskin, the most publicized issue in regards to Oklahoma and tribal nations in this election cycle is the McGirt decision and the impact of the McGirt decision within the state of Oklahoma and the tribal reservations. I'm sure most are aware of this monumental Supreme Court case by now, but can you give a brief synopsis on what the McGirt decision effectively did for the tribes in the eastern half of Oklahoma, and how it has impacted the state and Cherokee Nation for that matter?
Well, Tyler, it's the most consequential and impactful Supreme Court decision that is the McGirt decision in many generations. You'd have to go really back to the 19th century to find a case that has that much impact. And it's not just a decision that had impact, it has continuing impact and really evolving impact, which is why we need to be knowledgeable about it and engaged on it, whether you're tribal leaders or whether you're citizens of the Indian nations. So what it did is it restored in the eyes of the government of the United States, and like it or not for some state leaders, it restored in the eyes of the state of Oklahoma, the existence of the reservations of the 5 tribes and a 6th tribe, including the Choctaw tribe, or the Quapaw tribe rather, which to which McGirt was extended. If people think about the Cherokee Nation Reservation, that's 7,000 square miles of northeast Oklahoma. And then you think about Choctaw, you think about Seminole, you think about the Muskogee Creek Nation, you think about the Chickasaw Nation, add the Quapaw tribe in, it gets to, as you suggest, eastern Oklahoma, really half of Oklahoma. What does it do in addition to restoring the recognition of our reservations, which we insist never went away? It means that criminal jurisdiction extends over a great many people within the reservation, the tribal and non-tribal. That has implications for everyday police work, the prosecution of crimes, investigations, the protection of victims, and how justice is served in this country. And so everybody has a stake in that. So everybody has a stake in McGirt. But here's what's at stake in an election year, the first election cycle after the July 2020 McGirt decision happened. We're talking about this year, 2022. What are the candidates talking about? I hope they're talking about tribal sovereignty, and I hope they're talking about protecting tribal sovereignty, because if they're not, if they're silent about it, that ought to be of a concern. If they're opposed to it, that ought to be of even greater concern. And here's why, Tyler. The Congress of the United States has tremendous authority to look at a decision like McGirt, which is such a win for Indian country, and wipe it away with the stroke of a pen. They've done it before. Just go back to the era of Reverend Wilson's grandfather, he's talking about not even being a citizen and fighting for this country. What else was going on during that time period is the Congress of the United States started to wipe away as best they could Indian tribes in terms of our sovereignty and our right to self-govern. It happened before, it can happen again. If we don't want it to happen again, we have to raise our voice. And the simple way to do that is to register to vote and vote. So in terms of McGirt, I think we need to be looking at people running for Congress, the House of Representatives, that is, and the United States Senate, and state offices as well, but particularly those federal offices, and press those candidates on where they stand on McGirt and tribal sovereignty. Because ultimately, as challenging as McGirt is, that really difficult work of day-to-day policing and prosecuting and protecting victims and securing justice and fairness, all of that takes a lot of work and cooperation. And so what we'd be looking for in candidates is, are they committed to protecting tribal sovereignty, but also acknowledging that we've got to cooperate if we're going to protect everybody within our reservation in terms of the criminal justice system. And then McGirt has larger implications beyond criminal justice, because when you start talking about recognition of the reservations within Oklahoma, you start to talk about all sorts of opportunities to assert our sovereignty. And if we're going to do that, we have to have state and federal leaders that want to cooperate and want to acknowledge the reality that these reservations were promised, and promises ought to be kept.
Absolutely. You touched on it briefly, Chief, but in recent weeks, the chiefs of the 5 tribes have released statements regarding candidates who have made public declarations that do not support tribal sovereignty and would look to eliminate it if elected. And some of these candidates have been beneficial of tribal partnerships in the past, and they know the benefit that tribes have to the state of Oklahoma. When you hear that rhetoric from candidates running for office in Oklahoma, what is your reaction?
Well, it's very troubling. My reaction is to push back, because I think it's my obligation to do so as a tribal leader. And honestly, just as a tribal citizen, if I hear something like this, I've got to speak out, and I'd encourage everybody to do so. There's a whole lot of issues that face people running for office, a whole lot of issues they'd have to deal with if they were elected to the United States Senate or the Congress. We don't expect 100% agreement on everything, because look, Tyler, let's face it, if we agreed on everything, number one, we wouldn't be Cherokee. We disagree from time to time, but there are some fundamental issues that either make or break a candidate in terms of my support. If a candidate comes out in this day and age and says that the reservations ought to be disestablished, that means that that candidate believes that the United States ought to break its promise to Indian tribes. Well, that's the kind of rhetoric that we heard more of in the 19th century, but my goodness, this is the 21st century. If we've got candidates out there scaring people by saying, look, McGirt is the biggest threat to Oklahomans, that really sends a message to voters that McGirt is bad, sovereignty is bad, it's an obstacle, and it ought to be wiped away. That's really a deal breaker. And so I think that as citizens, as voters, when we start to listen to the candidates talk about tribal sovereignty, those are really key words. Disestablishment, that is a death knell for tribes. McGirt being a threat, that's a signal that they're going to support congressional measures to really cripple or wipe out the great wins that have come with McGirt and the restoration of our reservation. Some candidates have been silent on the issue. That's where I think individual voters can press them a bit. And I actually think that's where candidates who are running for office can become head and shoulders above the rest of the pack. There are some crowded fields out there, and they can say proudly and loudly, look, these are challenging issues, but I'll tell you this, I support tribal sovereignty. On that basis, look, there's plenty of room for disagreement and different philosophies about how you implement things like McGirt. But that baseline understanding that McGirt's not a threat, our sovereignty's not a threat, and that we shouldn't disestablish the reservations, we can work with candidates and office holders like that. But the ones who say it's a threat and who say that reservations should be wiped off the face of the map, face of the earth, look, we can't have those folks holding office.
Yeah. So as you, Chief, as the saying goes, elections have consequences. I will not ask nor expect you to endorse any individual running for office, but I will ask you what your advice would be to citizens you lead as they prepare to cast their vote in races that range from governor of Oklahoma to attorney general to congressional races to Senate and more.
Well, my advice is to do some research. We live in a day and age in which that's not particularly difficult to do. Now, there's a lot of a vast sea of information out there, that some of which is not accurate. But look, it doesn't take long to do something as simple as a Google search, Governor Kevin Stitt and sovereignty, or Governor Kevin Stitt and McGirt. Pretty quickly, you can see where the governor of the state of Oklahoma stands. John O'Connor, the appointed Attorney General. A person could Google him and they could find that he actually filed a brief in the Supreme Court asking the Supreme Court to break America's promise and wipe the Cherokee Nation and the other reservation lines off the map. You can do the same for these candidates. I mean, we've talked about some statements from candidates, and look, I'm not endorsing any particular candidate, but you can look at these folks running for Congress, do a quick Google search. You can find some information. Now, ultimately, you've got to decide as a voter what's right and what's wrong. But I will say this, elections do have consequences, as you say. If you set out this election, you've really given up a very precious right. I mean, look at what's going on around the world. There are people that are struggling and don't have a voice. And here in America, we have a voice if we'll use it. And it's a relatively simple task anymore to vote. Relatively accessible information if you're a Cherokee citizen or a citizen of another tribal nation, to do a little bit of research on your candidates. And there's also the good old-fashioned way of just asking the candidates. They're out there campaigning, particularly for these local office and these congressional offices. They're out in the communities. Ask them where they stand on sovereignty, and then test their answers with their own public statements. Tyler, I'm talking about something that takes maybe a few hours, collectively, maybe even less than a day, and a person can raise their voice. And they ought to think about Reverend Wilson's grandfather while they're doing it, who wasn't a citizen of this country, but fought for this country and fought for our freedoms. They ought to think about my grandfather and your family from that generation who lived during a time when the Congress had tried to wipe the Cherokee Nation away. Here we are in a position of strength. My goodness, let's use it.
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned this, Chief, the importance of getting candidates on record in order to hold them accountable later. Can you speak to that importance for citizens again, just to elaborate on that a little bit?
I think it's very important because it's really not difficult to do. I mean, the candidates are out and about, and I think I would be asking people running for the legislature, running for the United States House of Representatives, running for the United States Senate, and governor. I would ask them, where do you stand on McGirt? Now, look, sometimes you'll get a political answer out there. These folks are politicians. I understand politics. I understand being out on the campaign trail. But you ask them those questions, and then you test it with doing a little bit of research. And I think it's so important this year to hone in on things like McGirt, the reservations, tribal sovereignty. Those are so important. So I would encourage people to do that. One other thing I'd say, Tyler, is this. This is not a partisan issue. Here's what I would like every Cherokee citizen to think about. Both parties have had the opportunity to fail Indian country, and they've done it repeatedly. But there are people in both parties who more and more are waking up to the idea that sovereignty matters, that tribal self-governance is important, treaties are promises that should be kept. There's a wide array of candidates in both parties that will support tribal issues, but they have to hear from tribal citizens. They have to know tribal citizens are listening, asking questions, and above all, voting.
Yeah.
Reverend Wilson, I discussed McGirt and sovereignty with Chief Hoskin for a brief moment there, and how is at the forefront of this election cycle. My question for you is, what other Native issues do voters need to be aware of that could potentially be impacted by the results of the 2022 election?
That's a great question. Thank you. As I travel across the state among the various tribes, it varies. So of course, if I'm in the Cherokee Nation or Muskogee Creek Nation, the McGirt case around sovereignty is the big issue for that. When I was in Tahlequah for one of our very first events, met an older gentleman who came to sign up, Cherokee, who came to sign up to vote. And he said, the government wants to take away my hunting and fishing licenses. So that mobilized him. And we know that's a very big piece for many of our 5 tribes who offer those hunting and fishing licenses for our tribal citizens for that. I talked about younger folk who have different concerns rather than those pieces that I listed earlier. A lot around social justice. If I'm among Oklahoma City, Kiowa country, Comanche country, where they have some great organizations such as Murdered Missing Indigenous Persons, the need to find folk who are missing and to engage state governments and police forces to pay attention to what's happening. Those issues are very important to the people. But the other piece too is when we had this dialogue with all of our persons who work with us, one of our women said, she was Seminole, she said, McGirt, it's very, very important. All of this is important, but she said, when I go back home, I listen to people who worry about how they're going to pay for food, how they're going to pay for the utilities. And of course, that's right at the end of COVID. And so we hear issues about the economy, making ends meet, jobs, and of course, right now, high gas prices and more. And all those issues affect all people. And those are the other pieces that we've been hearing.
Yeah. Chief Hoskin mentioned the importance of research by voters. Reverend Wilson, what's your advice to Native voters and really any voter on how to research candidates and their stances on issues in order to be as informed as possible when selecting their candidate of choice?
Well, yeah, Chief Hoskin hit it just right when he talked about a lot of these candidates. We know where they stand by their television ads, by their media interviews, and so some of those are out there, and we just know right away where they happen to be at for that. Often evident through their advertising for what we read, and then when I'm with candidates too, I'll ask him. I had a young man who was running for office, and he said, "I used to be VP of my Native American club at whatever school it was," and I said, "Well, what do you know about the McGirt case?" He knew nothing, and I said, "If you want tribal support, you sure need to know what the issues are that are affecting our people." And I ask all the candidates who I supported, those who I know, about those issues. And I tell those who come to us, one of the neat things about Rock the Native Vote is that there are candidates who come to us because they're seeking out the Native vote. And we know that hasn't happened in some time. And I'll say, here are the issues that our people are going to be concerned about, and you need to be well versed on these issues. And I appreciate those that have taken the time to do that. In late summer, the League of Women Voters will put out a voter's guide that will be very helpful for the fall elections, outline stances, but not a lot about Native issues. And so one of the pieces that Rock the Native Vote's trying to work on is to develop some kind of publication, voter's guide that will highlight, we can't do this before the primary, there's far too many candidates, but that will highlight their stance on Native issues and so forth and so forth. And so we're hoping to put that together in the midst of everything else that we're working on.
The deadline to register to vote in the Oklahoma primary has passed, but what are some of the other key dates people should be aware of in regards to the primary runoff, and or general election in November?
Thank you. Yeah, our voter event we did with Cherokee Nation, others was the day before the deadline for the primaries. We got those off. We always encourage everywhere we go, folks, to do absentee ballots. That's a great way to do that. I do that myself. It's so easy. Monday, June 13th is the last day to request absentee ballots. June 28th will be the primary and special elections. And we know others, there'll be some others after that for some of the runoffs. June 28th, I mentioned July 29th is the last day to register for the August election. Of course, November 8th, the general election. And for all of our areas, we need to pay attention to the early voting that our voting boards offer from place to place. So those are the primary dates that we've been looking at that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, thank you. Moving from the state and federal elections, I want to briefly touch on some election reform legislation that was recently passed by the Cherokee Nation Council and signed by Chief Hoskin. Chief, a vast majority of the nearly 900 changes are considered housekeeping measures that range from updating definitions, capitalization of words and phrases, as well as the deletion of some outdated verbiage. However, there are a few other more noteworthy changes, one being the provisions inserted into the election code that are aimed at preventing dark money from coming into tribal elections. For our audience watching or listening to our broadcast, can you elaborate on what is meant by dark money and why you believe it is important to keep it out of tribal elections?
Sure. First of all, the council did a great job, and they have to review the election code after each election because honestly, we learn from each election. And I think Cherokee leaders largely agree that, look, our elections need to be transparent. They need to be fair. People need to have access to vote. So in the last 3 years, we've taken some steps to improve on those counts. The most recent significant reform on dark money is important. And this is the kind of issue that, whether we're talking about Cherokee Nation politics or the larger political scene in the state or in the country, that I'd love for Native voters to be talking about, and that is the influence of money in elections. The Cherokee Council, I think we only had one dissent on this debate, agreed that, look, if you're going to donate to a campaign, it's got to be out in the open. It's got to be on the record. No more secret donations. Keep in mind, Tyler, that in federal races, that's not the case. There's federal laws that actually allow for a fair amount of unregulated, what we call dark money. That's money you can't trace, that dump into different elections. I suspect, including the races that we're talking about on this podcast, the races for the Congress, that really, I think, damage our democracy, in my opinion, because what it does is it drowns out, number one, the voice of people, because there's a great deal that these funds go into purchase paid ads, social media feeds, and things of that nature. And the other thing is that if you're going to donate and you're donating on the record, and then your donation is wiped out because some far off corporate interest is dumping money into a race, that just doesn't seem fair. The reason we addressed it in tribal elections is because in 2019, it happened. Some unregulated, unknown amount of money dumped in the race from the outside. It just seems to the council, and I agree, that we ought to not have that happen again. Now, that's an example, Tyler, of democracy in action. That's what the voters said is, look, have this election law be transparent. But guess what? It happens because Cherokee people speak up. And if people like that idea, they should expand it to these state races and these federal races, and they should raise their voice. I mean, democracy works if we'll get out and vote and talk about the issues. But I've got great concerns that just this unregulated dark money, you don't know where it came from. You don't know their motives. When those get dumped into races, all this work that David and I and all of our folks that are on these various teams to register people to vote starts to really get eroded and really get undermined. And the power needs to belong to the people, not secret interests.
Yeah. Chief, I want to be out and transparent. This was the update to the election code was a collaborative effort between the Election Commission, Tribal Council, and I think the Attorney General's office here at the tribe as well, correct?
It was. And just briefly on that, I mean, that's what I think the Cherokee people should understand is when we reform the election code, we get input from the very men and women who run the elections. I mean, imagine that, ask experts how elections ought to be run. That's what we do at the Cherokee Nation. So we can get in our election commission, our attorney general's office, expert on the law, the council themselves, the members do their own research. I think it's a good work product. Frankly, that's how government ought to work. And I wish the state and the federal government would take a look at the Cherokee Nation. They might learn a thing or two about the public policy.
Yes,
absolutely. Chief Hoskin, is there anything more you would like to offer before we end this virtual roundtable discussion?
Well, I'm just so struck by the comments that Reverend Wilson made at the beginning about his grandfather, because as I mentioned, I think a lot about my grandfather. We're talking about generations of Cherokees who were denied not only their rights to vote within their own elections, but their right to be citizens of the country that had imposed so much trauma on their people. But here we are in 2022, Cherokees and citizens of other tribal nations can do like Reverend Wilson and I are doing, which is being engaged and knowledgeable about elections, and then casting our vote. If we do this and the kind of numbers that we're capable of, we can change the outcome of the race for the governor of the state of Oklahoma, the attorney general of the state of Oklahoma, the U.S. House of Representatives, including the 2nd District, which covers at least 2 reservations, the Cherokee Nation and the Choctaw Nation, the United States Senate, 2 races on the ballot. Look, Tyler, what happens in this election will, I think, determine how we go forward in terms of protecting our reservation, having funding for things like healthcare and education and housing, and whether Native people continue to get the respect they deserve. And we haven't got there yet. We need more respect, and our nations need more respect. But it'll depend on who gets elected. And the power is 100% in the hands of Native peoples.
Yeah.
We use it.
Reverend Wilson, anything to add before we conclude?
Sure. Yeah. Yes, Todd. I mentioned I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada here today, gathering with about 24 other cities, Native American urban centers who are focusing on voter engagement, funded by the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. So it's been great to listen to their stories, challenging at times to hear their issues. And I get envious of places like Washington and Oregon, whose Native people have shown what their voting power can do. Their senators and others who come to them courting their vote because they know they have that power and ability to elect them or not to elect them. And Chief Hoskin is so right. If we ever mobilize in this state, we could get into office. We wanted to get into office for the sake of people who have a great interest in our tribal nations. And so it's a continual challenge, but it's something that can be done. So we continue to hone in on that message of the power we have as a people, especially collectively for that. I'm so thankful for this great partnership we have with Cherokee Vote, with the Cherokee Nation. It's been great to work with Logan Lewis. And one of the neat things is that we get to use, he shares the resources you have, items that we give away at our booths that have the Cherokee Vote logo. We use those all over the state, and we're so thankful for that. So thank you to Logan and Jason McCarty, who really helped us to get engaged and make this connection for that. It's so appreciated, and we just need to continue to work together for the common good of all of our people in the state of Oklahoma. And thank you for having me.
Chief and Reverend, thank you for joining me today and discussing the upcoming state and federal elections, the Native issues that could be impacted this election cycle, and the recent election reform signed into law by the Cherokee Nation. I also want to thank our audience for watching or listening to this episode of the Cherokee Phoenix Breakdown, and be sure to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to watch our next episode. What up?